Hey everyone! Tonight we kick things off with the bizarre slow-motion demise of Henry VIII, the larger-than-life Tudor monarch whose reign overflowed with wives, wars, and some truly questionable decisions involving executioners' blades. Before you settle in, take a quick moment to smash that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely dig what I'm serving up here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always wild to see our global audience tuning in from every corner of the planet. Now, dim those lights, maybe crack a window for some ambient background noise, and let's ease into tonight's historical journey together. At the peak of his power, Henry VIII was Renaissance England's golden boy, towering, broad-shouldered, athletic, and by all contemporary accounts, an absolute heartthrob rocking those signature Tudor tights. Fast forward to his final years, though, and you'd be forgiven for mistaking him for a heavily decorated armchair with serious anger management issues. By the 1540s, Henry had entered what historians politely call his decline phase. The king had ballooned to over 300 pounds, mostly concentrated in the midsection, and was suffering from a delightful cocktail of health issues, including chronic leg ulcers, crippling gout, and the general consequences of eating like meat was about to be outlawed. His transformation from dashing prince to human pudding was so dramatic it deserves its own Greek tragedy, with extra gravy. This wasn't your standard royal overindulgence, though. Henry lived in constant, excruciating pain. Every joint screamed in protest. His ulcerated legs throbbed relentlessly and emitted a stench you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Something even a 14th century tavern would refuse to serve. Simple acts like climbing stairs, mounting a horse, or even walking unaided became impossible feats. That once magnificent codpiece now served primarily as a flimsy barrier between the king and harsh reality. Yet the illusion of the glorious monarch had to be maintained at all costs. Official portraits continued depicting him as virile and broad-shouldered, with eyes that whispered, "I'm full of divine purpose," rather than, "I've been sitting in this throne so long my armor has fused to my backside." His tailor struggled to keep pace with his expanding dimensions. One report claims his final suit of armor required a 54-inch waist measurement, and that's probably being generous. Behind the velvet drapings and jeweled adornments, the king was quite literally rotting, slowly, publicly, and with no expense spared. Courtiers developed creative strategies to avoid standing too close. Servants prayed nightly not to be assigned foot duty. The royal physicians threw everything at the problem, from lancing abscesses to experimental poultices, but most treatments yielded the same result: expensive linens soaked in royal bodily fluids. By the end, Henry VIII's most defining feature wasn't his beard, his codpiece, or even his impressive marital track record. It was his legs, or more accurately, what had become of them. What began as minor jousting injuries in his 30s had blossomed into what can only be described as biological horror shows. His lower limbs became plagued by chronic, festering ulcers, deep, weeping wounds that refused to heal and constantly seeped foul-smelling discharge. Imagine trying to govern a kingdom while essentially sitting atop two infected meat sacks. That was Henry's daily reality. These weren't just painful, they were legendary. Visitors commented on the odor from across cavernous palace halls. Foreign ambassadors dreaded court audiences not because of political tensions, but because they couldn't bear breathing near his ankles. Some accounts suggest the ulcers were so severe you could glimpse bone beneath the rotting flesh. The word ooze features prominently in diplomatic correspondence from the period. If Shakespeare had written body horror, this would have been his opening act. Naturally, the finest medical minds of 16th century Europe were summoned, which is another way of saying they slapped some herbs on it and prayed for divine intervention. Treatments included honey-soaked bandages, rose oil compresses, and whatever other remedies sounded vaguely church-approved. When that failed, they tried cauterization. Yes, literally burning the wounds shut, an experience Henry reportedly enjoyed about as much as you'd expect. And then there was the lancing. Oh, the endless lancing. A daily ritual of draining the wounds with blades and cloths. Imagine being the royal physician who had to show up every morning and announce, "Good morning, Your Majesty. Time to stab your legs again." There's a reason so many court doctors died young, probably from psychological trauma. The ulcers created a vicious cycle. The pain prevented exercise, which combined with Henry's notoriously gluttonous diet accelerated his decline. More weight meant more pressure on the wounds. More pressure meant more pain. More pain meant more violent mood swings. And more mood swings meant someone nearby was probably getting fired, exiled, or worse, introduced to the business end of an executioner's axe. If you've ever wondered what would happen if a man tried to eat his way into sainthood, or perhaps out of reality altogether, look no further than Henry VIII's daily menu. His meals weren't just excessive, they were borderline weaponized. Breakfast alone could involve multiple eggs, slabs of beef, ale-soaked bread, and possibly a roasted partridge just to get the digestive juices flowing. Fruits and vegetables? Only if they accidentally fell onto the roast or were being used as garnish. The Tudor court equated meat consumption with masculinity. The more flesh on your plate, the more divinely ordained your rule. And Henry, bless his heart, took this as a personal challenge. Roasted swan, venison, lamb, eel pies, game birds, all swimming in gravies and sauces with dubious medicinal properties. If it once breathed, Henry ate it. If it didn't breathe, it was probably used to thicken something that did. His drink of choice? Red wine, gallons of it daily. Water was for peasants and wound irrigation, not for kings. By the end, his body was likely 60% Cabernet. Now let's talk portion sizes. His meals were prepared in quantities that could feed small villages. Nominally for his royal household of tasters, servers, and musicians, but even accounting for the entourage, Henry ate like every meal might be his last. Spoiler alert, one eventually was. This high-fat, low-vegetable, high-gout diet naturally took its toll. Beyond the infamous ulcers, his digestive system was notoriously volatile. Royal physicians regularly documented his bloating, discomfort, and, let's just say, audible distress. You could practically set your pocket watch by his post-feast groans echoing through Whitehall Palace. And yet, astonishingly, Henry refused to change course. Even in his final years, when rotting teeth made chewing difficult, he still demanded massive portions. At state banquets, servants had to pre-cut his food so he wouldn't tire himself. The simple act of lifting a turkey leg had become an aerobic exercise. There comes a point in every overindulgent monarch's life when gravity wins. For Henry VIII, that moment arrived in his mid-40s, though it didn't knock politely. It arrived with a full marching band of gout, obesity, and increasingly furious ulcers. By this stage, Henry had grown so massive and immobile that moving his body required military-level logistics. Gone were the glory days of jousting tournaments and athletic court appearances. Now, getting him out of bed required multiple attendants, pulley systems, and what might be charitably called emotional blackmail. He didn't walk so much as get relocated. Royal engineers reportedly designed a mechanical chair, something between a reinforced wheelchair and a throne on training wheels, to transport him through palace corridors. His armor had to be custom-fitted not for battle, but simply to contain his royal bulk. You could have lost a small courtier inside one of his sleeves. Mounting a horse? Forget it. They needed a hoist system, essentially a royal crane, just to lift him into the saddle. And even then, the horses probably questioned their life choices. Exercise, once considered a noble pursuit, had become mythological. His only physical activity came from turning to yell at someone, and even that required noticeable effort. Doctors recommended gentle movement, like walking a few steps daily. But Henry preferred political executions over physical exertion. They burned fewer calories, but did wonders for staff morale. This physical decline wasn't just inconvenient, it was politically dangerous. Inactivity worsened everything: his circulation, his mood, his already hostile digestive system. And when you're the monarch, your health becomes everyone's problem. Entire court schedules revolved around how far he could be wheeled. State ceremonies were shortened to accommodate his limited mobility. If the throne room had contained a treadmill, It would have been purely decorative, or possibly used to power a roasting spit. Yet no one dared speak the obvious truth aloud, that the most powerful man in England was being crushed by his own appetites. Of all the indignities accompanying royal decay, few are as memorable, or as difficult to politely ignore, as smell. And Henry VIII in his final years reportedly had an aroma that announced his presence before he entered the room. Now, body odor wasn't exactly rare in Tudor England. This was an era when bathing was considered optional at best, perfume doubled as medicine, and the most effective deodorant was positioning yourself upwind. But even by 16th century standards, Henry's scent was remarkable. The primary culprit? Those infamous leg ulcers. These weren't your average boo-boos. They were cavernous, festering, constantly weeping infections wrapped in silk stockings and royal denial. The physicians did their best, honey dressings, herbal compresses, repeated lancing, but there's only so much you can do when the king's lower limbs seem determined to secede from the kingdom. The result was a lingering, acrid stench that haunted palace corridors like a vengeful spirit. Courtiers developed subtle maneuvers to back away mid-conversation. Foreign ambassadors reportedly endured audiences while clutching perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, the Renaissance equivalent of chemical warfare. And then there was the general hygiene situation, with movement agonizing and constant pain making baths difficult. Henry relied on powders, oils, and layer upon layer of rich fabrics to mask everything. He essentially mummified himself in velvet and linen, hoping no one would notice what was decomposing underneath. Spoiler, they noticed. Even his clothing became sacrificial. It said his garments had to be burned after use rather than laundered, a fitting metaphor for how much of his dignity had become disposable. The royal physicians did what they could. Honey dressings, herbal compresses, repeated lancing. But there's only so much you can do when the king's lower limbs are threatening to declare independence. The stench emanating from Henry's rotting legs wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It became a full-blown political liability. Courtiers developed elaborate strategies to mask their discomfort during audiences. Some carried pomanders stuffed with fragrant herbs. Others perfected the art of breathing through their mouths while maintaining appropriate facial expressions. Ambassadors from Spain and France wrote home about the challenge of conducting diplomacy while suppressing their gag reflexes. The Venetian envoy famously described Henry's presence as a test of both one's diplomatic skills and one's gastric fortitude. This wasn't just about unpleasant odors. It was about power dynamics in a court where every bodily function carried political weight. The king's deteriorating condition forced a complete reimagining of royal protocol. Traditional court ceremonies, designed around a mobile monarch, had to be radically altered. The lavish masks and dances Henry had once enjoyed were replaced with static musical performances where the king could remain seated. Even the layout of palace rooms was reconfigured to minimize the distance between his mobile throne and whatever destination required his presence. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Henry had built his identity on physical prowess, the golden prince who could outjoust, outhunt, and outdance any rival. Now trapped in a failing body, his legendary temper grew even more volatile. Servants reported finding furniture smashed after private rages. Court physicians learned to time their visits carefully, knowing the king's mood could swing from jovial to murderous based on pain levels. The same man who had once charmed foreign princesses now reduced his own wives to nervous wrecks with his unpredictable outbursts. His eating habits became both coping mechanism and slow suicide. Palace accounts from his final years show staggering expenditures on food. Whole herds of deer, barrels of the finest wines, exotic spices imported at tremendous cost. The royal kitchens operated around the clock to satisfy his cravings. Observers noted he ate not with pleasure, but with a kind of desperate compulsion, as if trying to fill some bottomless void within himself. The once athletic king now measured his days not in political victories, but in meals consumed. The ulcers on his legs became the focal point of his existence. What had begun as superficial wounds now tunneled deep into flesh, some reportedly reaching the bone. Contemporary medical texts describe the treatment process in horrifying detail. The probing of wounds with silver rods, the application of caustic substances meant to purge infection, the constant changing of dressings soaked through with pus and blood. Through it all, Henry maintained a courtly facade, insisting on conducting state business even as physicians worked beneath draped cloths to lance his abscesses during meetings. His bedchamber became both sanctuary and prison. The massive four-poster bed, once the site of romantic conquests, now served as command center for a failing regime. Here, propped up by cushions, Henry received ministers and signed documents while servants discreetly changed the linens beneath him. The room's heavy tapestries couldn't completely mask the smell of decay, nor could the constant burning of expensive incense. Court gossip claimed the king's bed had to be replaced several times because the wood became saturated with odors no amount of scrubbing could remove. The contrast with his youthful image couldn't have been more stark. Where official portraits still showed the vigorous, square-jawed ruler, reality presented a swollen, ailing man whose once famous red hair had thinned to wisps. Artists employed careful lighting and strategic drapery to maintain the illusion of royal vitality. One surviving sketch made by a careless court artist shows the truth: multiple chins, sunken eyes, and a general air of exhaustion. The artist was reportedly dismissed from court service shortly after. Pain governed Henry's world. It dictated his schedule, his moods, his decisions. Court physicians kept detailed records of his suffering. Days when the pain left him unable to speak, nights when his screams echoed through palace corridors. The treatments often proved worse than the disease. The cauterization of wounds with hot irons, the bleeding meant to balance his humors, the experimental poultices that sometimes caused allergic reactions. Through it all, Henry maintained a stubborn refusal to acknowledge his own mortality, insisting instead that the right combination of prayers, medicines, and royal willpower would produce a miracle cure. The political consequences were profound. As Henry became increasingly housebound, power flowed to those with regular access to the royal chambers: personal physicians, closet companions, the ever-present Thomas Cromwell. The formal structures of government gave way to bedroom politics, where decisions were made between dressing changes and doses of painkillers. Foreign ambassadors complained of government by chamber pot, as crucial policy debates were conducted while the king relieved himself into ornate commodes. Perhaps most tragically, Henry's physical decline coincided with his increasing isolation. The same man who had once surrounded himself with lively companions now drove people away with his odors and outbursts. Even his closest advisors limited their exposure, finding excuses to avoid prolonged private audiences. His children, once the pride of his life, were kept at careful distances, particularly the increasingly formidable Princess Elizabeth, whose sharp intellect seemed to unnerve her ailing father. Only the fool Will Summers, whose job description included speaking painful truths under the guise of humor, maintained something resembling genuine intimacy with the king. The psychological impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Henry had always defined himself through relationships, the charismatic center of every gathering, the virile husband, the doting father. Now he became a figure of pity and fear, his courtiers whispering behind raised hands about the old man's latest deterioration. The more his body failed him, the more he clung to the trappings of power, insisting on elaborate titles, demanding ever more obsequious forms of address, surrounding himself with symbols of authority even as real control slipped through his swollen fingers. Food remained his last reliable comfort. Palace records show increasingly exotic delicacies being procured at tremendous expense, rare fruits shipped from the Mediterranean, spices transported across dangerous seas, entire banquets prepared only to be picked at by the ailing king. The waste became legendary, with cartloads of untouched food reportedly removed from the royal apartments daily. Yet no one dared suggest moderation, not when the king's rages could turn deadly on a whim. The ulcers continued their relentless advance. What had begun as surface wounds now threatened systemic infection. Physicians whispered about mortification, the Renaissance term for gangrene, creeping through the royal limbs. Treatments grew more desperate, more painful, more humiliating. The strongest man in England, who had defied popes and princes, now screamed like a child as doctors probed his rotting flesh. Courtiers stationed outside his chambers learned to ignore the sounds, just as they ignored the smells and the increasingly erratic behavior. Yet through it all, the machinery of monarchy ground onward. Proclamations continued to be issued in the king's name. Portraits were still commissioned showing a vigorous ruler. The illusion of stability had to be maintained, even as the man at the center of it all slowly dissolved into pain and madness. When foreign visitors asked after the king's health, they received carefully crafted non-answers about temporary indispositions and expected recoveries. The truth that England's mighty ruler was rotting alive on his throne was the kingdom's most closely guarded secret. Henry's final years became a grotesque parody of kingship. The same hands that had signed death warrants for wives and ministers now struggled to hold a quill steady. The famous voice that had roared defiance at the Vatican now slurred its words between doses of pain-killing potions. The brilliant mind that had reshaped England's religious landscape now wandered through foggy valleys of confusion and paranoia. Yet still he clung to power, refusing to name a regent, insisting on making every decision even as his capacity for rational thought deteriorated. The contrast between public image and private reality became almost surreal. Official documents continued to refer to His Majesty's vigorous health, even as physicians secretly prepared poultices for wounds that would never heal. Portraits showed a strong-jawed ruler, while the actual man struggled to stand without assistance. The gap between myth and reality yawned ever wider, until finally, inevitably, it became impossible to maintain the facade any longer. By January 1547, the entire court moved in hushed tones, tiptoeing around the elephant in the chamber. Their king was dying, though no one dared say it aloud. Under Tudor law, predicting the monarch's death constituted treason, transforming royal physicians into the most anxious tightrope walkers in history. Henry now existed in a twilight realm, too powerful to ignore, too frail to properly rule, his every breath a political calculation for those around him. The once mighty ruler had become bedbound, not merely bedridden but bed-dwelling, governing England from beneath a mountain of embroidered cushions and increasingly erratic decisions. His legs had swollen to grotesque proportions, the ulcers now consuming so much flesh that physicians secretly questioned how blood still circulated. Breathing came in labored gasps, each inhalation a minor victory against the fluid slowly filling his lungs. Even his legendary appetite had diminished, though diminished by Henry's standards, still meant enough food daily to feed a peasant family for a week. Despite this obvious decline, court protocol demanded everyone pretend otherwise. Ministers developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms. His Majesty rests deeply today. The king is in a contemplative mood. Our sovereign enjoys vigorous digestion. Even his doctors spoke in careful riddles. One physician famously declared, "His Majesty shall recover, God willing," a magnificently non-committal statement covering all divine possibilities. Meanwhile, the man they discussed drifted in and out of consciousness, likely hallucinating about roasted pheasants and Protestant theology. Yet even in this diminished state, paperwork continued. Henry still signed documents with a shaking hand, amended his will with last-minute revisions, and appointed a regency council for his 9-year-old son Edward, who would soon inherit both a kingdom and debts larger than France. These weren't the dignified final acts of a noble ruler, but the scribbled commands of a desperately sick man whose entire court pretended he was merely having an off day. The atmosphere in the palace grew increasingly surreal. Servants changed sweat-soaked linens while ministers debated foreign policy at the foot of the royal bed. Ambassadors delivered reports to a monarch who occasionally dozed off mid-sentence. The smell of medicinal herbs mixed uneasily with the ever-present odor of decaying flesh. Through it all, The elaborate dance of denial continued. Everyone knew the truth, from the lowest scullery maid to the highest lord, but speaking it aloud could mean losing one's head in the most literal sense. Henry's physical appearance now bore little resemblance to the broad-shouldered image still being reproduced on coins and portraits. His face had bloated to nearly double its former size, the famous red beard now streaked with yellow pus from abscessed gums. The once piercing eyes had grown milky and unfocused, though they could still flash with sudden anger when his will was challenged. His hands, which had penned love letters and death warrants with equal ease, now struggled to hold a quill without trembling. Pain management became the central focus of each day. Physicians administered increasingly potent cocktails of opium, henbane, and alcohol, enough to dull the senses of a normal man, but barely touching Henry's agony. Servants reported hearing muffled screams from behind the heavy bed curtains, followed by exhausted whimpers. The strongest ruler England had ever known had been reduced to a frightened, suffering creature, clinging to life through sheer force of will and the best medicine 16th century gold could buy. The political stakes grew exponentially as Henry weakened. Factions jockeyed for position around the presumed Regency Council. Old allies became sudden rivals. Former enemies made quiet peace treaties. Through it all, Henry remained the sun around which this political solar system revolved, even as that sun visibly dimmed. Courtiers developed elaborate strategies to demonstrate loyalty while secretly preparing for the coming power shift. Some sent coded messages to potential successors. Others quietly liquidated assets that might become liabilities under a new regime. Religious matters weighed heavily on the dying king's mind. England remained Protestantish, reformed enough to anger Rome, but not so reformed as to commit to any actual doctrine. It was the ecclesiastical equivalent of mumbling something under one's breath while backing away slowly. When priests suggested Henry might want to make peace with God, he dodged them like a man avoiding creditors. One account claims he finally whispered, "All is lost," though whether he meant his soul, his kingdom, or just a misplaced chicken leg remains debated by historians. The palace operated under an unspoken "don't ask, don't tell" policy regarding the king's condition. Anyone caught using phrases like "last rites" or "funeral preparations" found themselves suddenly reassigned to remote postings. Even discussing potential mourning periods could be construed as treason. This created bizarre situations where carpenters worked on the king's coffin in secret workshops while tailors designed new summer outfits for him upstairs. The entire court became complicit in a massive, unspoken lie that England's most powerful man wasn't actively decomposing before their eyes. As January dragged on, Henry hovered in a twilight between lucidity and delirium. His body systematically shut down while his mind occasionally sparked with political clarity. He issued instructions about border fortifications, muttered about French spies, and rearranged his council members like chess pieces, all while floating on a narcotic cloud of painkillers. Most notably, he finalized plans for his tomb, a grand monument he'd been designing for decades. Spoiler, it would never be completed. For all his meticulous planning and power hoarding, the only thing that outlasted him was paperwork. The contrast between public and private grew starker each day. Official proclamations continued to describe His Majesty's improving health, while behind palace walls, physicians changed dressings on wounds that would never heal. Portraits still depicted the virile, square-jawed ruler, while the actual man struggled to keep broth down. The gap between image and reality became impossible to bridge, yet everyone pretended otherwise, maintaining the fiction that their king was merely tired, not actively dying. In his rare moments of clarity, Henry seemed to grasp his predicament. He reportedly asked for his favorite psalms to be read, particularly those emphasizing God's mercy. He inquired after his children, though whether out of genuine concern or political calculation remains unclear. Occasionally, his famous temper would flare, a servant dismissed for spilling medicine, a lord chastised for some perceived disloyalty. These outbursts became fewer as the month progressed, replaced by longer periods of staring blankly at the ceiling while physicians whispered in the corner. By month's end, the pretense became unsustainable. Even the most optimistic courtiers couldn't ignore the death rattle in the king's breathing or the gray pallor spreading across his face. The diplomatic corps sent increasingly alarmed reports to their home countries. The royal apartments took on the atmosphere of a waiting room, with everyone nervously anticipating an announcement that couldn't officially be made. Through it all, Henry clung to life with the same stubbornness that had defined his reign, refusing to surrender even when all hope was clearly lost. When the end finally came on January 28, 1547, the room didn't erupt in mourning or solemn proclamations. Instead, there was an awkward pause, then quiet panic. Because here's the Tudor twist, it was actually illegal to declare the king dead without specific protocols being followed. Simply stating the monarch had died, even if he was clearly deceased, technically constituted treason. So everyone present suddenly became very interested in pretending Henry VIII was merely resting, perhaps very deeply and permanently. Doctors, courtiers, and clergymen exchanged silent glances, waiting for someone to officially blink first. No one did. There was no dramatic announcement, no moment of national mourning, just the heavy silence of men thinking, well, now what? In unison. Eventually, they agreed to say nothing for several days, not out of respect, but political necessity. The succession needed managing, the council required assembling, and most importantly, 9-year-old Edward needed to be informed that he now technically owned an entire country along with some very angry neighbors. Meanwhile, Henry's body remained in Whitehall Palace, still technically the king in title, though biologically quite definitively otherwise. Ministers quietly arranged state affairs while maintaining the fiction that His Majesty was simply unavailable, which wasn't exactly a lie, just a spectacular understatement. While no one dared say the D word aloud, palace staff began making preparations with all the subtlety of a Shakespearean farce. Mourning clothes were discreetly ordered, seals were altered, and opportunistic nobles suddenly remembered obscure family connections to the soon-to-be king. Even foreign ambassadors weren't officially told at first. Diplomats from France and the Holy Roman Empire continued negotiating with straight-faced courtiers who smiled through clenched teeth, hoping no one noticed the faint scent of royal decomposition seeping through the velvet drapes. The entire nation was being governed by a man who, legally speaking, was still alive, just unusually quiet, not currently moving, and about to require an exceptionally large coffin. Once Henry was officially, if not immediately, dead, the royal handlers faced a new dilemma: what to do with the body. Unfortunately for everyone involved, the body had opinions of its own, mostly involving rapid decomposition. Let's be blunt, the man was enormous, weighing well over 300 pounds of asymmetrical Tudor pudding. His corpse was riddled with infections, ulcers, and decades of aggressive feasting. So naturally, it began breaking down faster than expected, much faster. In the chilly halls of Whitehall Palace, embalmers worked frantically to preserve the royal remains. But 16th century preservation techniques were rudimentary at best, essentially stuffing the cadaver with spices and wrapping it in linen like some grotesque Christmas ham. The hope was that cinnamon and cloves would overpower the scent of decay. Spoiler, they didn't. Despite their best efforts, the body began leaking, slowly at first, then with alarming enthusiasm. A mixture of bodily fluids seeped through the coffin lining, creating discomfort, confusion, and eventually widespread nausea among those nearby. It got so bad that during the funeral procession to Windsor, the coffin reportedly emitted dark stains and an odor so potent it startled the horses. One contemporary account claims stray dogs were attracted to the drippings. Yes, canines literally licking up the former head of the Church of England's remains, which probably wasn't how he envisioned his legacy being honored. To make matters worse, the coffin had been sealed hastily, royal urgency overriding craftsmanship. It swelled from internal gases and allegedly cracked, making Tudor-era Tupperware look competent by comparison. Everyone involved maintained perfect decorum. Mourning nobles walked beside the oozing casket with the dignity of people pretending they didn't smell anything unusual. Not a single person brought it up in conversation afterward, the ultimate English stiff upper lip. It's not every day a monarch's corpse makes headlines centuries later for its special effects. But then again, Henry VIII was never one to do things quietly. Not in life, and certainly not in death. As the funeral procession lumbered toward Windsor Castle, the sealed wooden coffin carrying England's most infamous monarch developed some issues. Now, you'd think transporting the remains of a king would involve some dignified marble container, or at least one that didn't behave like an overripe sausage casing. But alas, Tudor haste and human biology conspired to make Henry's final journey unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. The coffin began leaking, not metaphorically, but literally. Despite the embalmer's efforts, the combination of Henry's massive size, existing infections, summer heat, and primitive preservation techniques caused the royal remains to, let's say, express themselves. Contemporary accounts describe a black, putrid fluid seeping from the coffin's base during a stop at St. Abbey, the kind of detail that haunts historians and lunch breaks equally. The situation deteriorated further when, according to possibly apocryphal but widely circulated reports, dogs were seen licking up the trail of royal leakage. Picture the scene. A solemn state procession halted in its tracks, grieving nobles in black velvet, incense swinging, and a couple of opportunistic strays treating the late king like a spilled meat pie. Tudor England had many rituals, but canine-assisted decomposition wasn't supposed to be part of state funerals. Yet through it all, protocol prevailed. The coffin was discreetly wiped down as much as possible. The procession resumed, and absolutely nobody mentioned the elephant, or rather, the rapidly liquefying king in the room. This wasn't just an embarrassing leak. It became legend, a darkly comic footnote to Henry's already dramatic story. To some, it represented divine judgment on a tyrannical ruler. To others, it was the perfect punchline to a life of excess. Either way, Henry managed to upstage his own funeral without even trying. There's something darkly poetic, or brutally ironic, about where Henry VIII ultimately ended up. Not in Westminster Abbey alongside England's greatest monarchs, not beneath some towering marble monument befitting his ego. No, the man who shattered the Catholic Church, dissolved monasteries, and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England was buried in a modest vault beneath St. George's Chapel, almost like an afterthought. He was placed beside Jane Seymour, his third wife, the only one who gave him a male heir and, conveniently, died before she could disappoint him. And that was it. No grand effigy, no golden tomb, just a slab on the floor that, for over a century, didn't even bear his name. It wasn't until the Victorian era that someone bothered to inscribe it. Until then, Henry VIII rested in unmarked anonymity, just inches beneath the boots of tourists and the shuffling feet of royal weddings. Here lies the man who once thundered across Europe with papal bulls in one hand and a turkey leg in the other. The ruler who beheaded 2 wives, rewrote religious history, and turned England into a Protestantish experiment now buried like a moderately successful merchant. The irony is rich, yet somehow fitting. After all the grandeur, the power plays, the political tantrums, his final destination was quietly humble, almost accidental. No glorious tomb commissioned in life, no elaborate effigy, no altar to his glory, just a lead-lined box under a chapel floor, sharing space with Jane and, eventually, the decapitated Charles I, whose own death was, let's say, not subtle. For all his obsession with dominating history, Henry VIII ended up in a shared grave with minimal decoration and maximum foot traffic. Valhalla for kings? Hardly. More like a royal storage closet. But maybe that was the most Henry ending possible. No apologies, no weeping monks, just the slow, undignified decay of a man who always preferred the sound of his own proclamations to the whispers of his conscience. And so passed Henry VIII. No final dramatic words, no poetic closure, and absolutely no indication he believed anything had gone wrong. While Henry's corpse was still leaking its way toward Windsor, another historical figure was making her own scandalous exit: Valeria Messalina, the infamous third wife of Roman Emperor Claudius. If Henry VIII was a cautionary tale about gluttony and power, Messalina was its ancient Roman counterpart, a masterclass in lust, manipulation, and spectacular self-destruction. Born into the powerful Claudian dynasty, Messalina had imperial blood in her veins. Her great-uncle was Emperor Tiberius. Her cousin would become Emperor Nero. In other words, she was raised in a family where power plays were more common than family dinners, and everyone carried a dagger, if not in their hand, then firmly lodged in someone else's back. From childhood, Messalina understood the rules of Rome's treacherous game. Loyalty was currency. Appearances were everything. And a well-timed affair or alliance could mean the difference between exile and elevation. As a teenager, she was married off to her cousin, Tiberius Claudius Drusus, better known as Emperor Claudius. At the time, Claudius was seen as a political nonentity. Awkward, physically impaired, he limped and stuttered, and widely considered a harmless scholar. Few imagined he'd ever wear the purple. But power in Rome had a way of landing in unexpected laps. When Claudius became emperor in the chaos following Caligula's assassination, Messalina, barely 20, became empress. And she didn't waste time adjusting to the role. Almost immediately, she began reshaping her image, not as a demure consort, but as a force to be reckoned with. Behind her youthful beauty and public charm was a mind already scheming how to consolidate her position. Rome expected its empresses to be symbols of modesty and grace. Messalina, on the other hand, had ambitions that were anything but modest. She wasn't content being the woman behind the man. She wanted to be the one pulling the strings, using flattery, sex, alliances, and fear to climb higher. And in a court where everyone had something to hide, she was fluent in the language of secrets. In the empire's golden halls, where gossip traveled faster than messengers, Valeria Messalina was about to become a legend. And a cautionary tale. Once crowned empress, Valeria Messalina swiftly became one of the most dangerous women in Rome, not because of her title alone, but because of how she wielded it. She didn't just stand quietly beside Claudius in court. She was the whisper in his ear, the nudge behind his decisions, the architect of alliances, and the executioner of enemies, all while playing the devoted wife in public. But her influence wasn't just political. Messalina was infamous for something far more scandalous: her insatiable sexual appetite. Ancient sources, mostly written by men with axes to grind, paint her as Rome's most depraved femme fatale. The historian Tacitus claims she sneaked out of the palace at night to work incognito in brothels, competing with prostitutes to see how many men she could bed before dawn. The satirist Juvenal wrote of her hosting orgies so wild they'd make Caligula blush. Whether these stories were fact or slander, one thing was clear: Messalina's reputation was unlike any empress before or since. Behind every rumor, however, was strategy. Her lovers weren't chosen just for pleasure. Many were powerful senators, wealthy equestrians, or heirs to noble families. Messalina used intimacy the way other politicians used bribes. Sleep with her, and you might find yourself promoted. Cross her, and you might wake up exiled, or worse. Claudius, meanwhile, remained either blissfully unaware or willfully ignorant. His reign was consumed by administrative reforms, political infighting, and his own insecurities as an underestimated ruler. Some historians suggest Messalina manipulated him by playing the innocent, devoted wife, concerned, protective, doting. Others think Claudius simply didn't want to know. After all, the truth would have shattered the illusion of control he clung to. But Rome knew. The whispers in the forum, the jokes in the baths, the snide remarks from rival nobles, Messalina's escapades were legendary. And while her name became synonymous with lust and excess, she still held an iron grip on power. That contradiction, scandalous yet untouchable, made her even more dangerous. She blurred the line between seduction and politics, turning her body into a weapon and her bedroom into a war room. Rome's elite either feared her or fell for her, sometimes both. Still, as with all unchecked power, the walls wouldn't hold forever, and the higher Messalina climbed, the more unstable her empire became. Messalina's time as empress wasn't just defined by scandal. It was a masterclass in ruthless political maneuvering. She understood Rome's cutthroat game intimately and played it with terrifying precision. Her targets weren't always lovers. More often, they were threats, rivals, critics, or anyone who dared challenge her position as the imperial kingmaker. And she was merciless. One of her favorite tactics? False accusations. With Claudius often distracted or passive, Messalina could orchestrate a rival's downfall with just a well-placed whisper. She accused powerful senators of conspiracy, noble women of adultery, and even family members of treason. Many ended up exiled, executed, or forced to take their own lives. Their real crime? Being inconvenient. She didn't operate alone. Messalina had allies, corrupt freedmen, informants, and sycophantic magistrates who owed their positions to her favor. These cronies helped carry out her purges, blackmailed the vulnerable, and ensured enemies were destroyed before they could react. Claudius, ever the detached ruler, often signed their death warrants without realizing he was removing loyal men who might have warned him of the storm brewing at his doorstep. Her most notorious manipulation, though, was deeply personal. When Claudius married Messalina, he was in his 50s. She was barely 20. That age gap created a power dynamic ripe for exploitation. She weaponized her youth, charm, and beauty to maintain a facade of wifely devotion. Claudius, affectionate with her in public, believed he had a loyal partner. But in private, Messalina used that trust like a dagger. She also secured her position by bearing Claudius a son, Britannicus, making her not just empress, but mother to the imperial heir. It was a powerful shield, one that discouraged even the boldest advisors from speaking against her. Who would dare insult the mother of Rome's future? But the web she wove was tightening. The enemies she'd made were multiplying. Even her allies, fattened on imperial favors, began whispering about her recklessness. A court built on blackmail, and fear can only last so long before it turns on itself. Messalina didn't notice, or refused to, as her empire of secrets began rotting from within. And the people she'd crushed on her way up? They were waiting, quietly, patiently. Messalina's enemies were multiplying like rats in the Roman sewers, but none proved more dangerous than a former slave turned imperial secretary named Narcissus. This wasn't some lovesick admirer. The name was bitterly ironic. Narcissus, a shrewd freedman who managed Claudius's correspondence and controlled access to the emperor, had tolerated Messalina's antics for years. But when her ambitions grew teeth, even he reached his limit. The crisis came when Messalina, no longer content with manipulating from the shadows, made her boldest play yet. According to Tacitus, she began an affair with Gaius Silius, Rome's most handsome senator, not just another lover, but a calculated partner in what amounted to a slow-motion coup. Silius was wealthy, well-connected, and dangerously popular. More importantly, he was ambitious. Messalina didn't just want him in her bed. She wanted him on the throne. The plot thickened like bad wine. In an act of staggering audacity, Messalina reportedly married Silius in a public ceremony while Claudius was still very much alive and emperor. This wasn't some drunken bacchanalian revelry. It was a political earthquake. Witnesses described garlands, sacrifices, and a full wedding contract signed before stunned guests. Some accounts claim Messalina even discussed plans to adopt Britannicus out of the imperial line, effectively disinheriting Claudius's own son. For Narcissus, this was the final straw. The freedman who had turned a blind eye to brothel visits and petty intrigues now faced treason on an imperial scale. He moved with the precision of a man who knew his own head was at stake. Gathering evidence quietly, he alerted the Praetorian Guard and prepared his case like a gladiator honing his blade. When Narcissus finally approached Claudius, He found the emperor at his seaside villa in Ostia, blissfully ignorant. The revelation hit like a hammer blow. At first, Claudius refused to believe his beloved wife, the mother of his heir, could betray him so spectacularly. But Narcissus had witnesses, documents, the wedding contract itself. The emperor's initial disbelief curdled into something far more dangerous. What followed was a masterclass in political theater. Narcissus, knowing Claudius's tendency to vacillate, took control. He secured emergency powers and ordered Silius's immediate execution. The dashing senator was dragged from a banquet and beheaded without trial, his last sight the wedding garlands still hanging in his home. Messalina's other lovers and allies were rounded up in a bloody purge that left the Tiber's waters tinged red. As for Messalina herself, she made the fatal miscalculation that her husband's love would protect her. Fleeing to the gardens of Lucullus, ironically, once the site of legendary excess, she alternated between frantic scheming and pathetic pleas, convinced Claudius would forgive her as he had so many times before. She even sent the children to beg for mercy, a move that nearly worked until Narcissus intervened. The freedman, understanding that hesitation could mean his own death, sent a centurion with clear instructions: offer the empress the dignity of suicide, or drag her through the forum for public execution. When Messalina hesitated, the woman who had orchestrated so many deaths now frozen before her own, the soldier ended it with a swift thrust of his gladius. Thus died Rome's most notorious empress, not in a blaze of glory but a garden shed, her body unceremoniously handed over to her mother. Claudius's reaction? According to Suetonius, he returned to dinner and asked why the empress hadn't joined him. Whether this was shock, senility, or willful denial remains debated. What's certain is that by nightfall, he'd ordered her name erased from monuments and her portraits destroyed. The woman who had ruled through whispers was now unpersoned by the very system she'd manipulated. Yet history has a way of preserving what power tries to erase. Messalina's legend only grew in death, transforming her from a failed conspirator into the archetype of feminine wiles and political danger. The empress who dared challenge Rome's patriarchal order became both warning and fantasy, a cautionary tale told with lurid fascination for centuries after her blood had dried in the dirt. In the wake of Messalina's execution, the imperial palace felt like a theater after the lead actor has been dragged off stage, the air thick with uneasy silence and half-whispered questions about what performance might come next. Claudius, now a widower for the second time, found himself in an awkward position no Roman emperor had faced before. How does one replace an empress who was both mother to the heir and traitor to the state? Enter Agrippina the Younger, Messalina's polar opposite in every way. Where Messalina had been reckless, Agrippina was calculating. Where Messalina used her body as a weapon, Agrippina wielded her mind like a surgeon's scalpel. As the daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, and mother of a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, better known by his future imperial name, Nero, Agrippina came from imperial stock that made Messalina's lineage look like provincial nouveau riche. Agrippina played the long game with Claudius in ways Messalina never could. She didn't seduce, she negotiated. She convinced the grieving emperor that marriage to her would stabilize the imperial house, unite two branches of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and most importantly, provide young Nero with a father figure. The Senate, still shaken by Messalina's treason, quickly passed a special decree making their marriage legal despite their uncle-niece relation. But this was no love match. Agrippina wanted the throne, not just as consort, but as mother to the next emperor. Immediately after the wedding, she began systematically removing anyone who might champion Britannicus, Messalina's son with Claudius, over Nero. Courtiers who had survived Messalina's purges now found themselves facing Agrippina's even more efficient machinery of elimination. She installed her own people in key positions, the philosopher Seneca as Nero's tutor, the general Burrus as praetorian prefect. She isolated Claudius from his old advisors, including the freedmen who had once held such sway. Most brilliantly, she maneuvered Nero's adoption by Claudius, giving her son the official name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, a name dripping with imperial legitimacy. Meanwhile, Britannicus found himself increasingly sidelined in his own home. Tutors were replaced with Agrippina's loyalists. His movements were monitored. Even his meals were tasted by food testers, officially for his protection, but really to emphasize his vulnerability. The boy who should have been emperor-in-waiting became a ghost in the palace, his very existence a reminder of Messalina's disgrace. Agrippina proved far more dangerous than Messalina ever was precisely because she lacked her predecessor's recklessness. Every move was calculated, every alliance purposeful. Where Messalina had ruled through passion and impulse, Agrippina governed with cold precision. She didn't want to be empress. She wanted to be Empress Mother, the power behind two thrones. The final act came in 54 AD when Claudius died after eating a plate of mushrooms, possibly the only food in Rome more infamous than Messalina's final meal. Ancient sources universally suspect Agrippina's hand in the poisoning, though proof remains elusive. What's certain is that Nero ascended the throne without opposition while Britannicus was dead within a year, officially from epilepsy, though contemporaries whispered of poison. Thus did Messalina's legacy meet its end, not in the history books, but in the quiet strangling of her son's future. The woman who had scandalized Rome was now merely a cautionary tale, her bloodline extinguished not by sword or law, but by a carefully administered dinner. Agrippina had won, but as Nero's reign would prove, the victor in Roman power struggles often became the next victim. Nero's ascent to power marked the beginning of the end for the Julio-Claudian dynasty, not with a whimper, but with a spectacular fire that would etch his name into history as Rome's most notorious emperor. But before the flames consumed half of Rome, there was a brief, deceptive period where the young emperor showed promise. At just 16 years old, Nero initially appeared to be everything Rome could hope for in a ruler: handsome, cultured, and guided by the philosopher Seneca. His early speeches to the Senate dripped with republican ideals, promising to restore dignity to the office after Claudius's bumbling reign. The Roman people, weary of aging rulers, embraced their golden-haired prince with open arms. Even skeptical senators admitted the boy had charm when he wanted to use it. But Agrippina's carefully constructed web began unraveling almost immediately. She had assumed her son would rule through her guidance, but Nero had other ideas. The first cracks appeared when he fell under the influence of his former slave, now advisor, Marcus Antonius Pallas. Then came his infatuation with a freedwoman named Act, a romance that sent Agrippina into a rage. The mother who had orchestrated an emperor's death now found herself sidelined by a commoner. The power struggle escalated in ways even Agrippina couldn't predict. Nero, who had spent his childhood watching court intrigues unfold, proved an adept player of the game. When Agrippina threatened to support Britannicus's claim, Nero responded by having the boy poisoned at a dinner party, so brazenly that the convulsions began before the guests had finished their appetizers. The message was clear: this emperor wouldn't be controlled like Claudius. By AD 59, the relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. Nero staged an elaborate accident, a collapsible boat meant to drown his mother during a pleasure cruise. When Agrippina survived the sinking and swam ashore, Nero dispatched assassins to finish the job. The historian Tacitus gives us the chilling scene: the empress mother pointing to her womb and demanding they strike where Nero had once lived. They obliged. With his mother gone, Nero's reign descended into the madness history remembers. He competed in chariot races and always won, whether he deserved to or not. He performed on stage as an actor and musician, scandalizing the aristocracy who considered such professions only fit for slaves. He married his male lover Pythagoras in a public ceremony where Nero wore the bridal veil. And through it all, the Senate watched in silent horror, their once promising ruler transforming before their eyes into something Rome had never seen. Then came the fire. In July of AD 64, flames erupted near the Circus Maximus and quickly spread through Rome's narrow streets. For 6 days and 7 nights, The city burned while Nero allegedly played his lyre and sang of Troy's destruction, an image so perfectly villainous that modern historians debate its accuracy. What's certain is that Nero used the disaster to rebuild Rome in his own image, constructing the extravagant Domus Aurea, Golden House, where entire neighborhoods had stood. When whispers blamed the emperor for starting the fire, Nero needed scapegoats. He found them in Rome's growing Christian community, a mysterious sect already viewed with suspicion. Tacitus describes the horrific persecution that followed. Believers covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, others crucified and set ablaze as human torches to light Nero's gardens. It was a cruelty so inventive it would stain his legacy forever. The final years of Nero's reign read like a particularly bloody tragedy. Multiple assassination attempts, a revolt in Gaul, the suicide of his former mentor Seneca. By AD 68, even the Praetorian Guard had abandoned him. Fleeing Rome, Nero reportedly muttered, "What an artist the world loses in me," before stabbing himself in the throat with a dagger. His death sparked a civil war that would end the Julio-Claudian line for good. In the end, Nero became the monster Messalina never was, not through reckless passion, but through unchecked power and a complete detachment from reality. Where Messalina's sins were personal, Nero's were cosmic in scale. And where Agrippina had meticulously planned every step to the throne, her son's reign proved that in Rome, no amount of planning could control what happened once absolute power was obtained. The fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty left Rome reeling, but history has a way of resurrecting its villains in the most unexpected forms. While Nero's name became synonymous with tyranny, Messalina's legend took on a life of its own, transforming from historical footnote into the archetypal wicked seductress that would haunt Western imagination for centuries. The ancient historians who first recorded her story, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, painted with broad, salacious strokes. Their accounts, written decades after her death, must be read with skepticism. These were men writing under emperors who had every reason to blacken Claudius's reign. Yet their lurid tales became gospel. Messalina competing with prostitutes, exhausting multiple lovers in a single night, holding orgies that would make Caligula blush. The details grew more outrageous with each retelling, the line between history and misogynistic fantasy blurring beyond recognition. By the Middle Ages, Messalina had become shorthand for dangerous female sexuality. Medieval moralists cited her as proof that women's lust could topple empires. Dante placed her in the second circle of hell, eternally whirling in the storm with other lustful souls. Renaissance artists delighted in depicting her scandalous end, often with more attention to her exposed flesh than historical accuracy. The Baroque period turned her into operatic tragedy. Claudio Monteverdi's 1642 opera, L'Incarnazione di Poppea, featured a Messalina so villainous she made Nero's scheming wife seem virtuous by comparison. The Enlightenment attempted to rehabilitate her image slightly. Philosophers like Montesquieu used her story to critique absolute power rather than female nature. But Victorian-era historians doubled down on the moralizing, their purple prose describing Messalina as a perfect volcano of vicious passions whose unbridled sensuality corrupted Rome. Even today, psychologists debate whether Messalina complex should be recognized as a condition describing hypersexuality in women. Modern scholarship has begun peeling back the layers of myth. Archaeological evidence suggests Claudius's reign was far more stable than ancient sources claim. Some historians now argue Messalina may have been executing legitimate purges of corrupt officials rather than killing for sport. The infamous brothel challenge? Possibly a political smear conflating her with actual prostitutes named Messalina attested in Pompeii graffiti. Even her marriage to Silius might have been less a lust-driven coup than an attempt to protect her children from palace intrigues. Yet the truth remains frustratingly elusive. The real Messalina lies buried beneath 2 millennia of bad press, her voice silenced not just by assassins, but by generations of historians more interested in morality tale than historical fact. What survives are fragments, a name on a recovered statue base here, a passing mention in a recovered letter there. Enough to suggest she was more complex than the monster of legend, but not enough to fully redeem her. Perhaps the most telling clue comes from her son Britannicus's fate. Had Messalina truly been the nymphomaniac monster described, wouldn't Nero have used that to justify his murder? Instead, the young prince was discreetly poisoned at a dinner, suggesting even his killers knew the stories couldn't withstand scrutiny. The final irony? The empress, who became synonymous with sexual excess, may have been destroyed not because of her sins, but because she dared to be a woman wielding real political power in a man's world. In the end, Messalina's ghost haunts us not because she was uniquely wicked, but because she represents every powerful woman whose ambition was recast as hysteria, whose political maneuvers were rewritten as bedroom intrigues. Her story endures not as history, but as warning, a reminder of how easily a woman's legacy can be reduced to her sexuality when men control the narrative. History's judgment often says more about the judges than the judged. As we close this bloody chapter of imperial Rome, let's consider the curious parallel between Messalina and Henry VIII, two figures separated by 15 centuries, yet bound by similar myths. Both rulers saw their complex legacies reduced to single, salacious narratives. She the nymphomaniac empress, he the wife-killing glutton. But peel back the layers, and their stories reveal uncomfortable truths about how power corrupts, and how we remember that corruption. Henry's ulcerated legs and Messalina's alleged sexual escapades became shorthand for their reigns, overshadowing their genuine political achievements. Henry broke England from Rome and established the Church of England. Yet we remember his marital drama more than his theological impact. Messalina stabilized Claudius's early reign through strategic alliances, yet history recalls her bedroom politics over statecraft. Both rulers suffered from what we might call the Caligula effect, when outrageous anecdotes eclipse substantive governance in historical memory. The comparison grows richer when examining their deaths. Henry expired in his bed, leaking fluids into expensive linens while courtiers pretended not to notice. Messalina died in a garden shed, her blood seeping into the soil as her name was erased from monuments. One death was passive, the other violent, but both reflected how absolute power isolates its holders, leaving them vulnerable when their bodies or political capital fails. Modern medicine has retrospectively diagnosed both figures with possible medical conditions. Henry's mood swings and leg ulcers suggest type 2 diabetes or Cushing's syndrome. Messalina's hypersexuality, if real, might indicate histrionic personality disorder or trauma responses to childhood in Rome's cutthroat court. These armchair diagnoses reveal our need to pathologize bad rulers rather than acknowledge how systems enable their worst impulses. Their posthumous reputations followed eerily similar arcs. Protestant reformers weaponized Henry's marital history against Catholicism, just as Christian moralists used Messalina to attack pagan Rome. Victorian historians framed both as moral lessons about excess. Even their modern rehabilitations mirror each other. Recent biographies emphasize Henry's intellect and Messalina's political acumen, trying to balance the sensationalism with substance. Perhaps most telling is how both figures became blank screens for projecting cultural anxieties. Tudor England saw Henry's obesity as proof of God's judgment on schismatics. Renaissance Italy interpreted Messalina's story as warning against powerful women. Freudians analyzed them as case studies in psychosexual development. Each era molds their stories to confirm contemporary biases about power, gender, and morality. The final irony? These supposedly monstrous rulers now generate more scholarly debate than their respectable contemporaries. We remember Henry more than the prudent Edward VI, Messalina more than the competent Tiberius. Their infamy grants them immortality, while saner rulers fade into obscurity. As historian Mary Beard observes, the Romans knew what we keep rediscovering, that virtue is boring, but vice makes for compelling narrative. So what ultimately connects these two flawed rulers across the centuries? Both reveal the uncomfortable truth that power doesn't corrupt equally. Henry's tyranny was enabled by England's centralized monarchy. Messalina's influence stemmed from Rome's chaotic imperial court. Their stories remind us that systemic flaws matter more than individual villains, and that we're still wrestling with how to remember powerful people who defy our moral categories. As the ink dries on this account, one lesson endures. History rarely judges us for what we did, but for what others needed us to represent. Messalina became the wanton woman, Henry the corporeal king. Caricatures that persist because they serve someone's purpose. The real tragedy isn't their flawed humanity, but our continued insistence on reducing complex lives to cautionary tales.